Hello, my name is Kathleen. I went to a Catholic school in the west of Scotland, where, as you can probably imagine, inclusivity was not the top of the priority list. As a result of this, as a queer teenager, I was constantly exposed to homophobia in school, meaning that I was so full of fear and self loathing that I wasn't able to come out until after I left high school. But nevertheless, I did come out. Despite the school's best efforts with their Adam and Eve messages and tales of Sodom and Gomorrah, it did not stop me realising who I was. In 2018, the Scottish Government announced that they would be introducing LGBT themes into the curriculum and training teachers in such topics. LGBT stands here for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. This made Scotland the first country in the entire world to introduce such topics into their curriculum, which led to a rise in debates surrounding whether or not LGBT education should actually exist. This is because of a distorted perception on what LGBT education actually is in reality. There's two main issues here. Firstly, is this distorted perception of what LGBT education actually is, and secondly, is another distorted perception, but this time between the perceived conflict between religious groups and LGBT groups. This distorted perception was raised by the Kantar Research Group in 2020, who found that 4 out of 10 parents are not comfortable with their idea of their children simply being taught that being gay is okay. This is due to fear that this message may force them to become gay. We apply that same logic to my experience, where heterosexuality was constantly forced on me. I would also be straight, and yet I'm not. This topic came to a head in 2019 during the Birmingham protests. This is where a group of parents in Birmingham protested over concerns that their 5-year-olds were being taught how to perform gay sex simply because they had a gay teacher. This was obviously not the case at all. However, because their teacher was gay, accusations were made. This again raises the wider point of my second issue of this perceived conflict between the religious groups and the LGBT groups. Both the Quran and the Bible focus on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as their main conflict with homosexuality. And yet, Muhammad and Jesus both constantly teach the message of loving thy neighbour. Sodom and Gomorrah is just one story in these vast texts, compared to the constant messages throughout of loving one another and withholding judgment. This is often made out to be a lot worse than it actually is by the mainstream media. A quick Google search of Muslim LGBT groups brings up a whole variety of responses, such as the Muslims Against LGBT Hate group, which has over 10,000 members. Muslim groups, Christian groups, are not the enemies of LGBT groups. In fact, there is a major overlap between them. I myself come from a very Catholic family who accept me for who I am. Some of my friends are Muslim and they're also part of the LGBT community. What I think is most important to bear in mind here is the Equalities Act of 2010. This states a bunch of protected characteristics which cannot be discriminated against. Included among those are both sexual identities and religious identities. This means that it is the responsibility and the duty of both schools as a whole and teachers individually to ensure this law is being upheld. This means teaching children to respect everyone's identities, no matter what. I myself have also experienced homophobia as a teacher. A few years back, a group of primary sevens saw me at the weekend holding hands with my then girlfriend. Like all gossip does in schools, this news spread like wildfire, leading to the deputy head pulling me into her office and accusing me of promoting homosexuality. If this terminology brings up old memories for you, it might be because it's the exact same language used in the Section 28 clause. Section 28 was introduced by Margaret Thatcher in 1988. It stated that any local authority employee, which includes teachers, were not allowed to say anything which might be construed as promoting homosexuality. Or in the words of the clause itself, as you can see here, promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. This was repealed in Scotland in 2001, and yet even today, there are still teachers who think this is in effect. Back in 2019, I carried out my own research into the prospect of teachers receiving LGBT training to find out their thoughts on this. Many were against it, worrying about the effects of Section 28, making it illegal for them to discuss such issues. Others were worried about what parents might think, again bringing up this idea that teaching children about being gay will make them gay. None of the teachers were necessarily against it. All of them gave at least one response which showed support for the LGBT community. However, they were all united in this fear of discussing such issues in their classrooms and said that they actively avoided it unless they were absolutely forced to. This again links back to my first point of the distortion of reality between what LGBT education is thought to be versus what it actually is. A lot of the focus is often on the sexual education aspect. Now, the changes the Scottish Government are bringing in is including sexual education, but this is only a small part. Other changes include teaching about LGBT history and discussing homophobia and how to prevent it. Hate is taught. No one is born hating someone else based on their sexuality or their religion, and yet schools have become breeding ground for hate. LGBT Youth Scotland are an organisation that interview children and young people across Scotland each year. In 2020, they found that 70% of children had heard homophobic language being discussed in schools, but only 12% of this was addressed by teachers. This is despite the previously mentioned 2010 Equalities Act, which makes it the duty of teachers to ensure children are not being discriminated against based on both their gender and their sexuality. I gave teachers in each of my interviews a scenario they had to respond to. The scenario was the same for each teacher and went as follows. A child by the name of Hannah comes into school and says they want to be known as Greg and for male pronouns to be used. Now, this is a tricky situation. The debate around transgender children and young people is a complex one, and it has many valid viewpoints. However, I would like to discuss the response of one participant in particular, and I quote directly in saying, "Well, that's all well and good, but what if another child comes in and says they want to be known as Dragon Master 3000? Now, of course, this response is extremely satirical. However, it raises the wider issue that the mere mention of LGBT identities is like a virus that will infect everyone. What bears in mind remembering here is that transgender children and young people have the worst levels of discrimination out of the entire community. Again, LGBT Youth Scotland found in 2020 there was a growth of 35% in transphobic language, despite there only being a 2% growth in the amount of children and young people actually identifying as transgender. Another big concern raised by people often is that children don't know at such a young age what their gender or sexuality is. To this, I have 2 points. Firstly, research suggests that by the age of 4, children have a solid understanding of what their gender identity is. But anyway, what does it matter? That is the point of childhood and adolescence. To grow up, to figure out who you are, to make mistakes, work it through, it's fine. But secondly, and more importantly, why do we not apply these same pressures to straight children that we do to queer children? Soon as a little boy's born, he's put in a t-shirt reading ladies' man, and heterosexuality is forced upon them as the only valid option. In school, when children have boyfriends or girlfriends, it is fine, as long as they are of the opposite sex. Then at Christmas parties, when little boys ask little girls to dance, no one gasps in fear that they might be a dreaded heterosexual, because it's just the norm. Now, equally, I'm not saying that a little boy asking another little boy to dance automatically makes him gay. My point is, we do not apply these same pressures to straight children that we do to queer children. I grew up with the idea that LGBT identities were so horrific that they didn't even bear mentioning unless it's the punchline to a joke. And yet here I am, a self-identified queer adult, still experiencing homophobia in school, this time just as a teacher. Teaching children to be straight does not work. Therefore, even if someone did try to teach a child how to be gay, it also wouldn't work. Children will inevitably be who they are. So if you're a teacher, a parent, or even just someone with a younger sibling, please tell them it is okay to be who they are, because only they can decide this. But at least they'll know, no matter what, they are loved and they are accepted. Thank you for listening.